Welcome to another episode of Aliyah Money Talks, brought to you by Blue and White Finance. I'm excited to have a legal expert here on the show to talk all things estate planning for dual citizens, specifically Americans in Israel and mixed families and all those kind of things. Osher Felicia Haleli, welcome to the show. Why don't you start and tell us a bit about yourself and about your work?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's always a delightful opportunity to be able to let people know kind of what the law is, what my experience has been with the clients that I work with. So I grew up in the US and my parents made Aliyah when I was young, and I've been back and forth. So I am licensed only in the US as an attorney. I'm registered in Israel as a foreign lawyer. I now live in Israel full time, and I am bilingual. So that is doable for those of you who are considering Aliyah. And I practice U.S. international private client law, which includes estate planning, U.S. international inheritance issues, renunciation of citizenship, if anyone is thinking of that, and also people who are considering relocating to the U.S. or non-U.S. citizens who own assets there.
Great, great. So if we kind of dive into that, let's start with a very simple question, which is what is estate planning? What does that mean?
And that's a great question because most people call me and say, I need a will. I want to make sure that everything's set up so that, God forbid, when I pass away, my kids know what to do. And the truth is that I tell people who call that really we're going to talk about three areas of law. We're going to talk about incompetency law because that's a big life event as well that's becoming more, unfortunately, more and more prevalent. And so if any of us should experience dementia, who's going to take care of paying our bills? Who's going to take care of giving instructions to our financial advisor? Who's going to make medical decisions for me? Who's going to decide where I live and whether or not I have a companion? So that's the incompetency piece
Yeah.
that we talk about. And then we do talk about inheritance law, the actual practical steps of what happens when someone in the family dies, right? And what happens if they die in Israel? What happens if they die in the US? What happens if they die in the US owning something in Israel? What happens if they die in Israel owning something in the US or owning something elsewhere in the world? How can the heirs that person would like to have inherit the property become the new owners of that property? And when I say property, I'm not talking about just real property. A lot of
Right.
people immediately think about real estate, but it could be stocks, it could be money, it could be options. Someone I advised several years ago had owned a medallion for a New York City taxi cab, right? And so it could be anything that you own. It could be also, I ask my clients about um, um, uh, valued instruments, that I mean musical instruments that they might
Definitely.
own, or art. And then we also talk about taxation because, unfortunately, in our day and age, both incompetency and death come along with some tax issues, specifically in the United States, but also in Israel. And so we need to factor that into our planning.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, they say the only thing certain in life is death and taxes. So,
Right.
good things that that everybody needs to planning for, even if they really don't want to be planning for. So, let's say somebody goes ahead, they make Aliyah, they bring over some assets to Israel. At that, maybe they made Aliyah with a will in place. Before we get into trust and things more complicated like that, in that scenario, do they need an Israeli will to cover their now new Israeli assets, whether it's just money sitting in an account or they go ahead and buy a property?
So that's a really good question. And as I'm not licensed in Israel, I can only speak from my experience, having had clients who come in and say, "Okay, mom and dad passed away. Now what do we do?" And so I use the resulting clients, right? People who come after death, to learn how to do better planning.
Right.
Because that way we know what to do for the planning so that we can assure a more smooth transition later. And so, my best advice is that it's going to be best if you sit down with an Israeli attorney and talk these things through. But again, from my experience, it depends on what you own in Israel and what your wishes are. And so I do
Yeah.
want to say that there's no cookie cutter advice that I have, right? There's no one solution fits all. It's really important to have a team of advisors that a person who is going through the estate planning process puts together. None of us really want to hear that, right? Because we don't want to put pay out money in order to preserve our assets and our wealth that we've amassed for the family later on. But if you think about it, it's an investment in your future. It's an investment in your spouse's future. If God forbid they should survive you, it's an investment in your children's future and your grandchildren's future. And so the and I'll come back around to your question, but I think it's an important point to make. The team of advisors that I typically tell people that it's important for them to have in place is a U.S. estate planning attorney such as myself who knows the international aspects of U.S. estate planning. That's very important because most local U.S. estate planners do not know. So it's important to
Yeah.
make sure that they are familiar with what I call global families, as well as an Israeli estate planning attorney, a US CPA who knows the US Israel tax treaty, and an Israeli CPA. And of course, if there's a
Yeah.
financial advisor who's already involved, or if the family is asking me, what should I do with my investments now? Then I always
Right.
refer them to a financial advisor. And so it's important to have the financial advisor on board as well as we're formulating what that estate plan should look like. So yes. If they're going to live in Israel, they should at least do incompetency planning in Israel, which will typically result in having an Israeli power of attorney. Many of us have heard that term used with regard to our US documents and have had US powers of attorney. Those US powers of attorney, for the most part, will
Yeah.
not be able to be used here in Israel. Certainly, the ones that deal with medical issues and making decisions as to our person will not be able to be used here in Israel. They just won't make sense to any of the medical institutions here. And so you're going to want to make sure to have in place what you need in order to make sure that your spouse or your child who you want to make decisions for you will be able to do so without a lot of bureaucracy. And as far as an Israeli will, it really depends on what you own in Israel. Sometimes if all people own here is a bank account, if they're
Yeah.
renting an apartment, if they haven't bought a car and they're not planning to, if they haven't brought over significant personal property like artwork that has value, or as I said before, jewelry or instruments that have value, then they might not need an Israeli will. And I will say that the Israeli documents are an expense. It's certainly an investment, and
Yeah.
typically they're more expensive right now than the U.S. documents. And so it's important to really look at the situation. I don't want my clients to pay extra money for a document that they don't necessarily need.
Neat. Yeah. Makes sense. Makes 100% sense. But if we look at it, let's say from the other direction, somebody's been living here for maybe decades, but I think it's very common, especially amongst Americans, to keep assets out of Israel, specifically, in U.S. based accounts or things like that. So somebody living here and they say, "Hey, I've got an Israeli will. Is the Israeli probate process going to be sufficient for handling my U.S. assets, or should I be looking into the U.S. side of the equation a bit more?"
Great. So it's a wonderful question, and it's that question, that age-old question that I've been asked for decades, which is, should I have one will or two wills? What should I do with my US assets, right? So if a person is an Israeli resident, and I want to backtrack for a moment to Olim. People contact me right before. I just had a conversation last week with someone who's making Aliyah in 2 weeks. And I said, you know what? If you're in good health, let's wait with your estate planning, right? Get settled in. It's okay. God willing,
Yeah.
everything will be fine for just a
No
few
time.
months. But estate planning documents, especially if you already have something in place, it doesn't need to be your main concern. And in this particular case, this family had old estate planning documents that were in place, but really did not say what they wanted them to say. And so it was important to them to have a kind of stopgap, right? If God forbid something should happen during the months that they're settling
Next
into
few
Israel.
months.
So I want to say that about Olim is it's okay to put this kind of further down the list of opening a bank account, getting a car, finding a place to live, right?
Yeah.
Um, getting your
Enough on
Olim
your plate already.
benefits.
Yeah.
Exactly. Um,
Yeah.
so when you've settled in, or if you've been here as you presented the question, Aaron, for a while, and you're an Israeli resident and you own assets in the U.S., once again, it depends on what you own in the U.S. If you own real estate in the U.S., then we're going to look at whether or not you want to own that real estate outright, in other words, in your own
Right.
name or in the name of you and your spouse, or do you want to own that in an LLC, which is a limited liability company, which is for risk management. Typically, God forbid somebody slips and falls on your property, can they sue you for more than the value of the real estate? And so we'll have those types of conversations. In those cases, sometimes the Israeli probate will be sufficient. Sometimes you'll have to take the Israeli will and the Israeli probate and admit it in the U.S. In a court for Israeli probate. If you have an LLC, you can use the provisions in the LLC agreement to govern survivorship, and then you don't need a probate order to pass it on to whoever you want to pass it on to. If you own accounts in the US, now that's a news story. And we've had this news story now for about a decade, and people are very surprised to hear about it. I often get the question, "Are you sure?" To which I try to answer as humbly as I can. Unless they've changed the law in the last couple of days, I'm pretty sure.
I'm sure.
um, and so, unfortunately, I don't. Um, or for I'm fine with it, but my clients are less fine with it. I don't always have the best news for my clients, right? And that is that if you live outside of the US and you're still a US citizen and you own accounts at US financial institutions, there is a law on the books that has been enforced for about the last decade or so, which requires something called a transfer certificate from the IRS. And it's not required if you reside in the US. It's only required if you reside outside the US. And so people say to me, well, my mother passed away and she didn't need it. Well, she passed away in New Jersey. So no, she didn't need it. But if you pass away living in Israel, this is something that's going to be required by the US financial institutions and by transfer agents. So if you own stocks outright, and not through Aaron's brokerage firm, then or the way that Aaron tells you which account it's in, then you
Right.
may also still need the transfer certificate for those individual stocks as well. Not may. My experience has been you will need it.
You will.
In
Yeah.
addition, in the last 2 years, I've seen U.S. financial institutions require it for retirement plans. And so if you have an
For
IRA,
IRAs. Yeah.
yes. If you have an IRA, if you have a 401k, if you have a 403b, if you have a KEO, if you have a SEP IRA, if you have a Roth IRA, then the transfer certificate is most probably, and I say most probably because so far it's been only one U.S. financial institution that I've heard of, but often the others start to kick in afterwards
Kick on.
for the retirement plans as well. So, Aaron, if it's okay with you, I'm just going to go on for another 2 minutes on what does this exactly look like. Um,
Yeah. What is this
so,
transfer certificate? For sure.
yeah, so the answer to your question about the Israeli probate order is the Israeli probate order will suffice for the inheritance piece, but for the tax piece, that's where the transfer certificate kicks in. And so in the US, there's something called an estate tax. And that's a tax that can apply to someone's assets after they have passed away. Currently, the lifetime exemption is quite high, so a lot of clients don't fall into that category. Some do, and then we do some planning around the estate tax. Now, the U.S. financial institution has been ordered by this section in
Well,
the U.S. tax code to find out whether or not this estate owes estate tax. And the way to do that is to get a transfer certificate from the IRS. And so the IRS makes a determination in that's embodied in this transfer certificate as to whether or not estate tax was owed, and if it was owed, that it has been paid. Unfortunately, the IRS currently has a backlog of 12 to 18 months. And so even if we submitted the request for a transfer certificate, just a few weeks after death, they won't even look at it for 12 to 18 months. There's no way to expedite the process, and there's nobody to talk to. So it's not like you can call and say, hey, did you get my request? Hey, are you processing it? What's happening with it? You won't know. And so most of my clients want to try and uh, implement their estate planning, taking into consideration the fact that they don't want to have to obtain their heirs won't have to obtain this transfer certificate. I want to say one more
This
sentence.
just yeah, I
Go
just want
ahead.
to understand that this transfer certificate is imposed specifically, this requirement, on people living abroad, on Americans living outside of the US.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great.
It's also imposed on non-US citizens, but that's not our topic
Okay,
today. But
right.
yes, it's absolutely. The issue is residence. And so some
Yeah,
people say to me, "But I'm using my US address." Yes, but your death certificate will be Israeli.
right.
And once the family obtains an Israeli death certificate, they then take it to the US embassy and get a report of death abroad from the US embassy, and it will state there what your last address was in the US, what your address was in Israel. And so it's going to be very clear from the official government documents that you were living abroad. In addition,
Yeah.
you're asking your heirs, if you're trying to get it over on the get one over on the US financial institutions, you're asking your heirs to lie for you. And most of my clients, when they realize that, say, no, you're right, we don't want to do that. We
I
want
don't
to
want
be
that.
on the up and up.
Yeah.
I want to point out a very important issue. So a lot of people say, well, I'm just going to put my spouse on my account, or I'm going to put my child on my account. We'll own it jointly, and then it'll go automatically to my spouse. Unfortunately, the US financial institutions, and I've seen this actually happen in practice, will freeze the account upon receiving notice that one of the owners has died. Nothing goes in, nothing goes out, even for joint accounts. And so
Wow.
making an account joint does not solve the problem.
Yeah. Wow. And that's, I think, pretty worrisome to people that they could possibly lose access to their accounts. Why don't we start drill down a bit deeper on this topic, and what are some ways around this transfer certificate process? What are some of the common solutions, and we could talk about those.
So the most common solution is to have a US trust own your US non-retirement assets. And I specify non-retirement because retirement assets, it's very difficult to put them in trust.
Can't be
It's
interest. Yeah.
possible, but it's very difficult. And so we need to start talking about various what I call vehicles of inheritance, right? We're going to have the Israeli will, if needed, in Israel. Should the Israeli will also be applicable to the US? Typically, I would say in 98% of the cases of clients who reside in Israel, the answer is yes. It's just easier to have one will. Let's work together, the US estate planning attorney and your Israeli estate planning attorney, and have that applicable. Let's have a revocable living trust in the US to cover your US non retirement assets. If you are a US citizen married to a non US citizen, there are specific provisions that we need in that trust, and we have to discuss whether or not the non US citizen spouse can have access to those assets and what it will
Yeah.
look like. And that has to do with some estate tax issues. And and then we also have to realize that you've got these retirement plans in the US, perhaps, and that those will require a transfer certificate. And so it's okay. It's okay if
Yeah.
those have to go through that process, and you might not be able to get them for a couple of years, while you also still have access to all the other assets, which are under the trust and in Israel, right? So we kind of talk
Right.
about these groups of assets that the family owns. Another solution, though, Aaron, is to consider going through US probate. And when you read on the internet, right, if you Google U.S. probate, you're going to get the scare tactics of like,
Horror
oh my
stories. Yeah.
God, don't go through probate, no matter what you do. And so, when I have had articles on my website about, if you can avoid probate, try to avoid probate. But if you think about it, once you've gone through the Israeli probate and you take that order to a US probate court, it might be shorter and less costly to do that than to wait 2 years for the IRS to respond with a transfer certificate. And so there are two scenarios that I encounter in my practice, right? One is an after death scenario where clients come to me and say, hey, listen, I need this transfer certificate thing. Do you know anything about it? And I say to them, sure, let's look at your options. And we talk through the option of US probate versus cost benefit analysis. How long is it going to take? We have some jurisdictional questions there that I won't go into too much detail about. So there are some legal issues we need to deal with if we're going to go through US probate when it hasn't been planned ahead of time that we'll go for US probate versus getting the transfer certificate. And then the other scenario that I see in my practice is the planning scenario, which you and I are talking about, which is, okay, should we plan for our heirs to have to go through
Probate.
US probate in addition to the Israeli probate? And again, it depends on the family. I will say, Aaron, and we haven't talked about this yet in this meeting of ours today, but there are parents who say, you know what, I'm going to be dead, so let the kids deal with it. It's okay. Whatever it is, it is.
Make them work for it. Yeah.
I think it's more of an issue of being tired. They just don't want to have to
Don't
go
want to.
through the estate planning process themselves. And I will say, it's not an exhausting process, but it's certainly a process. And sometimes I have clients, lo alenu, it should not happen to us, that contact me when they have been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And do they really want to deal with drafts of documents going back and forth, transferring their assets into a trust? You know what I mean? Like it can seem like a lot to them. So I do try to talk with them about getting the additional generations, right? The next generations involved at this point, and we can do that together. And present it to the parents so that the parents can focus on what they need to focus on, which is health and their current quality of life and their well-being, but also be able to again invest in the future.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. And I think these topics are difficult at every stage of life. Certainly there can be more difficult circumstances, but these are tough choices and these are tough things to think about and have to deal with, but they're important. I guess on the other side, why would you say that some people do not want to go have their heirs go through the probate process? What are some things to know about the probate process beyond kind of the effort and the legal costs? What might be some worries over there?
So I want to make sure that we're talking about U.S. probate, because Israeli
Yeah.
probate is unavoidable.
Right.
Okay, there's really we really do not use trust in Israel. I want to clarify and I want to really emphasize that if you have a U.S. estate plan that puts everything into trust, do not use that in Israel. Aaron, did I say it loud enough?
We heard you.
Okay. It will take years for the Israeli financial institutions and the Israeli recorder of deeds here, the tabu, to be able to recognize the trust and implement that plan. So it's not a good plan. And so on the one hand, we're balancing here, and once again, I'll come back around to your question, I promise. We're balancing here between separately doing the Israeli planning, separately doing the American planning, but really having a global plan, right? We want to take a look at the big
Works together.
picture here of what's going to happen after death. And so some of the concerns with regard to U.S. probate are very legal issues. And so if I don't make too much sense, I apologize ahead of time, and listeners are welcome to contact me with questions. But one of the issues in blended families, if you will, right, where we're talking about second marriage or third marriage, is that if you go through probate, then in the U.S., then whatever was subject to probate can be subject to something called an elective share, where the current spouse can get a percentage of what went through probate, whereas maybe that's not what the will says. Maybe the will leaves
Right.
everything to the children. And people are absolutely flabbergasted to find out that there is forced heirship in the United States, but there is,
Right.
and so that's one issue. Another issue is if you have debts in the US. If you have large debts in Israel, I can imagine that an Israeli lender would reach out to a U.S. court for this. Then what is subject to
Okay.
probate can be used to pay can be forced to be used to pay your debts,
Pay your
and so
debts.
that's another issue. And a final issue is that it's very public, right? A trust is a
Yeah.
private contract between people. Nobody has to know what's written in the trust. It's not required to provide the entire trust to most U.S. financial institutions today. A summary of the trust, what they call a trust certificate or trust certification, is sufficient, as opposed to probate, where your entire life is spread out in public. Anyone can go online and find it, right? Everything that the person
Yeah.
owned at death, what it was worth, who owned it with them, where it's located. You know how we all don't want to tell people our account numbers in the United States. We're very careful with our social security numbers. Well, all of that is listed on the public documents that
In the
are
probate.
filed for probate. And so those are some of the issues. But I will say that with good planning, none of those are issues.
Even if going through the probate process.
Correct. Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Good.
Yes.
Okay. Cool. So let's say somebody's a little bit hesitant, a little bit nervous about the probate. They're looking at the other side, the other option of putting U.S. assets in a trust. Can you just explain a little bit what's a trust? What does that mean? What does that mean? I'm putting assets in a trust. How does that help me? Give a basic rundown of that.
Absolutely. So a trust is a contract, and it's a contract between several different parties. Um, the person who establishes the trust, it's someone that we call a settlor with an O, or a grantor, and then the other party who signs this contract, this trust agreement, is a trustee. Now, typically, the types of trust that I have been talking about, there is as many types of trust as you can think of. You can be very, very creative with trusts. And so the types of trusts that I have been talking about are called revocable living trusts. And so typically the grantor settlor is the same person as the trustee, at least starting out during their lifetime, as long as they're competent enough to continue to make decisions with regard to their assets,
Yeah.
financial decisions. And so the trustee is going to be the person who's going to manage the assets that are now going to be owned by the trust. So if Aaron sets up the Aaron Trust, right?
Trust. Yeah.
And then Aaron is the settlor. Aaron will be the trustee if we're talking about a revocable living trust, and Aaron will also be the beneficiary of the trust during Aaron's lifetime. Maybe Aaron and Aaron's spouse will be the settlors, the trustee, and the beneficiary. And then it'll
Yeah.
say in the trust agreements that I write are typically about 35 pages long, and so they specify out what will happen upon incompetency of the trustee, right? Who will take over as trustee? So often, if we're talking about two spouses who are US citizens, the other spouse will take over um, managing the assets. Sometimes there's a spouse who is not a US citizen, or sometimes there's a spouse who is not very financially savvy and doesn't want to be. Then often we'll talk about a different family member, who may take over at that point, or may be co-trustee together with the with Aaron, who set up the trust, for example. Um, and then what happens after death is also written into the trust agreement. And so often people will say, well, I really want to go equally to my children. Sometimes people will have a disabled child, or a child who's having some financial difficulty or some mental illness, or is in a marriage that might not be the most stable marriage, right? And so there are circumstances to consider where we might want to have one of the other children, or the surviving spouse, continue to manage that child's assets within the trust agreement for a while at least. Sometimes
Yeah.
the people will want to leave assets to grandchildren, and that can be done in the trust until the grandchildren are old enough to receive the assets. And so the trust becomes in the U.S. an entity. In Israel, it's not, and that's one of the issues
Okay.
that we have in Israel. And so um, I want to clarify very clearly that tax wise, the revocable living trust is completely transparent. So there is no difference, not in Israel, not in the US, although we always have an Israeli attorney or an Israeli CPA look over the trust before it's signed to make sure. There's no difference between before the trust and after the trust for the assets that are going to be in the trust and how they're treated income tax wise. The type of trust that I'm talking about also, Aaron, does not give any protection from estate taxes. Okay. It's
Okay.
solely for planning purposes, not for tax
Purposes.
purposes. And I also wanted to say that it will not help for the transfer certificate issue if the trust is not funded after it is established. How is it established? It's signed. The contract has to be signed. I give instructions to my clients. It has to be notarized. Now it's been difficult with getting a U.S. notary. It needs to be a U.S. notary or it will not be easily
Okay.
accepted by the U.S. financial institutions. If you happen to be going to the States, wonderful, UPS store, something like that,
Perfect.
or your bank. If not, there are digital notaries these days, and those trusts have been accepted across the board over the last 3 years since the beginning of Corona for my clients.
Yeah.
And then it's important to transfer your non-retirement assets in the U.S. into the trust to be owned by the trust. If you have not done that, if the trust sits in the drawer after you've signed it, then really you haven't done anything
Right.
to solve the issue with the transfer certificate.
Right. And transferring doesn't necessarily mean moving assets to a new institution or anything like that. It just means changing the name and the title of the account, basically, which every broker, every right asset manager will have a process for that you'll be able to do within, without moving your money anywhere, basically.
And Aaron,
Right.
I have had clients who have come to me and said, the financial institution wants $300 to transfer it into the trust. Absolutely not. If any of
No.
the
Right.
listeners here have that issue, please contact me, contact Aaron. Okay. We can tell you from experience that the financial institutions absolutely do not have a problem transferring it into either a new account that is now titled in the
Yeah.
name of the trust. That often happens. So you may have to have some bureaucracy of, moving direct deposits
And
over or moving credit cards to be paid out of the new account, etc. um, but or they may be able to just retitle your current account. But
current account.
it's important to know that this doesn't cost anything.
Yeah. All right, great. I mean, that was a really great rundown of trust and how they can help as far as planning. If we take a step back, I would say, and we look at, again, let's say a family who's making Aliyah, they've got their will in place in the U.S., let's say a basic will, and they're worried about their most precious possession, their children. They've got minor children, and they want to make sure that now that they live in Israel, if God forbid something were to happen to them, their wishes for their children, who is going to take care of their children, is being taken into account. Now, I understand this is an Israeli legal issue, but maybe name some things that they should take into account to make sure that they're doing what they need to do to make sure their children are taken care of.
So I'm going to assume that if they already have U.S. wills, then there should be a provision in their U.S. wills as to who should be named
Yeah,
guardian if both of them pass away. And so
right.
if once again, if they don't have time to deal with us, while they're settling into Israel, first thing, then those U.S. wills will be honored by an Israeli court as long as they've been executed correctly according to whichever state they were living in before they came to Israel. And so they shouldn't worry too much about that piece. When they get a chance, it's time for them to definitely have an Israeli will prepared for each of them, which should clearly state who they wish to be the guardian of the children after they pass away. And there are several issues here, Aaron, right? There's an issue of where should the children stay? Are they going to stay in Israel, or are they going,
Israel.
or do the parents want them to go back and stay with grandma in the US or with a sibling of the parents in the US?
Yeah.
And if the so I want to point out here, and this is the same by the way in the States, and a lot of people are surprised as to what happens in Israel and think that it's unique to Israel. It's not, okay? But what a person states in their will is just a request. And so it's not an instruction, it's not a demand, and it might not be fulfilled. So please understand that and have a conversation with your Israeli attorney about that. Please understand also that if an Israeli court has a request in a will, whether US or Israeli, it doesn't matter, okay, to send children outside of Israel, you're going to need a good case as to why an Israeli court is going to want to give up, custody of children and send them essentially on Yerida, right? And so what I tell people is to have a conversation with their Israeli attorney as to whether they can put 2 or 3 sentences into their will as to why this person, why is it important? My child has special needs and my mother knows how to take care of it.
Yeah.
They can get better benefits in the United States after our death. I don't know. Okay. It's important to us that they be with family. And even though we made Aliyah and we would love for them to stay here, they really won't get the support that they're going to be able to get with family in the United States, something along those lines. And so it's important to explain that. Another piece to think about with minor children is what do you want to happen with your marital home? Right? If you own your home in Israel and you're raising your children in Israel, do you want them to be able to stay in the house with whoever is going to now be guardian of them
Yeah.
until age 18 or so? Right? And so if you do, thinking again, we're always looking ahead with this planning, right? So thinking about, well, then I need a fund to be able to fund the maintenance costs of the house until the children reach the age where they no longer want to live in the house, right? Or no longer need to live in the house. And so once again, having these conversations with the Israeli attorney and how does this fit into the US piece? Well, I tend to have the global conversations with the clients. So I bring up these issues with clients. I say, write these down, or I email them afterwards and say, here are the issues that you want to have a conversation about with your Israeli attorney, because we need to have this foresight, right? Um,
Yeah.
the other piece, Aaron, with regard to the minor children is we've got who's going to take care of them custodian wise, educate them, step into the parents' shoes, although that's impossible, right? And who's going to provide for them financially? Do you want that to be
Right.
the same person? And so I often have conversations with clients about maybe you want to split
Okay.
that up so that you've got some like oversight going on between the two. You've got
Yeah.
someone who's in charge of the finances, perhaps is the trustee of the trust that we talked about in the United States, and they need to get a list of what are the potential expenses, what are the projected expenses over the next 6 months, and I'll move that money to Israel so that the guardian who's actually taking care of the kids, who's somebody else, will be able to pay them, and then the guardian who's taking care of the kids will have access also to the accountings of the trust, and that way you can have people who are watching out for the best interests of the children.
Yeah. Makes sense. No, and it just goes to show that, careful planning around all these issues, and there's many things to think about and consider, but planning is important. And it's really important to think these things, forward. And if we take a step forward, we look kind of to the future. If somebody was thinking about what is the procedure for going through an Israeli, getting an Israeli probate process, getting a report of death abroad, from the U.S. Embassy here in Israel, just give me a basics of what that process might look like.
Sure. So if someone passes away in Israel, within about 3 weeks, they will receive in the mail, a, not them, but their heirs will receive in the mail a death certificate from the Ministry of the Interior, Misrad Apnim. And
Okay.
I'm sorry, these days it's called Lishkata Uchrusin, but same. And
Yeah.
and they will email the U.S. Embassy in Israel and say, hey, so and so passed away. Here's their information. Here's a copy of the death certificate. Can we please get a report of death abroad? And anyone can do this. I've done this for clients. So you don't have to be a family member to be able to do this. And you don't need authorization from the family, so far has been my experience, to be able to do this. So if it's, if the bereaved spouse or children are just not up to doing this, so early in the
Yeah.
process, it's okay for them to send a friend, okay,
Okay.
or a professional. Um,
Yeah.
and the reports of death abroad are free. And essentially, they save on having to get a notarized translation with apostille stamp of the death
Of
certificate. So it's worthwhile to put the energy into going down to the embassy with the relevant documents, U.S.
documents.
passport. They'll tell you what you need. And 2 weeks later, ish, um, whatever address you put down, they will mail 10 copies of the report, original copies with a seal of the report of
Okay.
death abroad to that address. And that's essentially all you will need to start the process of U.S. retirement plans and some of the Israeli retirement plans, Kupot Gemel, Karnot Talmud, Pensia, right? Um,
Right.
and by the way, I'm sorry, on the Israeli side, you don't need the report of death abroad. You just need the death certificate, okay?
Right.
And if you need additional death certificates, you can get those typically online. You can order them and have them mailed to you. They are at a cost, but it's not a huge cost
Okay.
from the Misrat Panim website. And then getting Israeli probate entails essentially submitting a request. In the United States system, we would call it a petition for an Israeli probate order from I believe it's the Rasham Yerushot, the inheritance registrar. And
Okay.
a family does not have to hire an attorney to do so, but most families will. And I would say that for your peace of mind, to make sure that it's done right and to not have to deal with additional red tape, there's going to be enough. There's going to be enough forms to
Yeah.
fill out. There's going to be enough times you have to sign your name. There's going to be enough times of saying what your Teudat Zehut is or your social security number is, et cetera, et cetera. It might be worthwhile for you to spend a few thousand shekels to hire an attorney to just say, give me a list of what you need. I'll give it to you. You deal with it. You submit it. And today, it's all done online. Most requests for an Israeli probate order can be done online, which shortens the process, helps with issues. So it kind of smooths the process a little bit more. I will say that the backlog is not too bad typically for Israeli probate. Um, One of the other myths that we've heard about U.S. probate is, oh, it takes so long. And so here in Israel, my experience has been that it takes somewhere between 4 and 6 months to get the Israeli
Okay.
probate order. It depends on the backlog in the particular court that you're dealing with.
Got it. Perfect. Great. I mean, this has been a really fantastic overview of kind of many of the important considerations around U.S. Israeli estate planning. Where can people reach out? I'll definitely share some links under this video. But what's the best way to get in touch and reach out to learn more?
Sure. You can certainly Google me, Osher Felicia Haleli. There aren't many of us in the world, and with that name. And my website is OFM, M like Marjorie, which is my middle name, -law.com. And I give free initial consultations. I'm happy to answer any questions. If people call me with very pointed questions and say, how much do you charge? I say, let's just talk for 15 minutes. I might be able to just answer your questions, and you don't need an attorney. I don't want to charge people if they don't need to to be charged.
Yeah.
And I really try to help them through a process that most people avoid. So, Aaron, if I can just leave people with one last thought,
Please
and
do.
that
Yeah.
is, I think that in our day and age, planning is more important than ever. We have so much upheaval going on in our country right now and in the world in general, that planning seems almost futile. Like kind of what's the point? I mean, the law is going to change anyway in a couple of years, right? As it did yesterday. And so, and so the answer is that you can, and I didn't say this before about the trust, and I meant to. You can always change your estate plan as long as you're competent. You can
Yeah.
change it, and if you're not competent, but we've put the correct provisions into your incompetency documents, the person who takes over your affairs can change them for you. And I don't mean that in a
Right.
sinister way. I mean, if the law has changed and the plan that you had in place is no longer helpful from a tax standpoint, or is no longer relevant because one of your children doesn't need the money or will be in a bad tax bracket, or a lot of different things can happen over the years, thank God, then it's not difficult to change the plan, and it's important to do so. And so that's another piece, which is these plans are not fixed, and people sometimes it's draining to them to hear that okay, I'm doing the plan, I'm finally got there. It's been 30 years. I've been waiting to do a will. I'm finally doing it. And I say to them, okay, but we're looking at a picture of sometime in the next 5 to 7 years, because if you live beyond that, you'll do whatever you want with your money. You don't need the estate plan if you're competent and living.
Right.
But if God forbid you pass away in the next 5 to 7 years, at least you can somewhat dictate what's going to happen in the future.
Perfect. Really, really appreciate it, Osher. This has been really fantastic. Be sure to check out Blue and White Finance for a lot more great content, and we'll see you soon.